Hello, my students. My name is Emily Poole, and I'm here to talk to you about AP European History Unit 4. Now, just like in previous videos, I've made for you a speed review sheet to go along with this video. Make sure that you download that and have it handy. This video is going to work a little bit differently than last videos because I'm going to take a brain break about halfway through. Because while I love Unit 4, it's a lot of content that you just need to know. So make sure you have that downloaded and ready to go when we take our brain break, probably about 15 minutes into this video. As always, I love to start out each unit with a unit summary of the unit in 5 sentences. So here we go. Sentence number 1. Scientists rely on observation, experimentation, and math in order to figure out the natural laws that dictate the cosmos. Number 2. Enlightenment philosophers attempt to make a better society and minimize suffering through a focus on rationalism and reason, and through debating political representation, the rights of man, limitations on rulers, and the role of religion. Number 3. New economists, called physiocrats, challenge mercantilist policies and instead favor free trade and open markets. Number 4. Religion increasingly becomes a matter of private concern, and deism and atheism grow in popularity. And number 5, the population of Europe steadily increases, urbanization continues, and as infant mortality decreases, there's an increased focus on child rearing. But how did it all get that way? Let's contextualize. Yo, it all traces back to the Renaissance, the printing press, and the Protestant Reformation. Do you remember how in units 1 and 2 and 3, I talked about how these Europeans are challenging traditionally held sources of power in a ton of different ways? That is continuing in this unit with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. With more access to written work and just an increase in literacy in general, Europeans start to challenge long-standing scientific views. And not only that, they're continuing to challenge the power of the monarchs and government, especially as these new Enlightenment philosophers posit new political theories. And of course, there are going to be some economists that challenge this long-standing mercantilist policy. Hey students, just a heads up before we get started, this unit covers a lot, and it's just people and theories that you need to know. Rather than getting bogged down in the details, make sure that you pay attention to those 5 overarching sentences that I said at the beginning of this video. If you have those big picture ideas in mind and you have those solidified in your brain, you can more easily start to plug in vocab terms or people as evidence. All right, let's start with the scientific revolution. Now, prior to the scientific revolution, many Europeans believed in the geocentric model of the cosmos, the idea that the Earth is standing stationary in the solar system and the sun and the planets rotate around the Earth. And that does make sense, right? Like, I cannot currently feel the Earth hurtling through space, which it does at 18.5 miles per second, by the way. So it would make sense that the Earth is standing still, and I see the sun rotate in the sky, so therefore, of course, the sun is rotating around the Earth. But new advances in astronomy led people like Copernicus and Galileo to question that traditionally held source of knowledge. Copernicus posited that the sun, not the Earth, was at the center of the solar system. This is an idea called the heliocentric model, but he was so worried about upsetting the Catholic Church and its teachings that he didn't actually publish his findings until shortly before he died. Galileo made some advances on the telescope, and then he pointed it to the stars, where he studied the heavens and discovered moons, proposed theories of tides and comets, and observed the phases of Venus. And it was through these findings that he proved Copernicus's heliocentric theory and was brought before the Catholic Church's Roman Inquisition as a result. Galileo, who by all accounts was a Christian and did not believe that the placement of the Earth or the placement of the sun was a matter of salvation, was forced to recant his findings and spend the rest of his life in house arrest. Now, students, I think it's easy for us to think that religion and science are these two unconnected, unrelated things, and that's not how a lot of these early scientists viewed it. A lot of these scientists, like Galileo, sought to prove the beauty of God's creation through examining the intricacies through which it was made, and they believed that in doing so, more glory would be brought to God. And some of these scientists, like Kepler and Paracelsus, believed that the cosmos were still governed by spiritual forces. However, deism did increase during this time period. Deists view God as a divine clockmaker, that God set the world into motion, but then has since been absent from human affairs. But the church wasn't the only institution challenged during this time period. Another person that came under scrutiny of these scientists was the Roman physician Galen. Now, Galen believed in the humoral theory of disease. The body is composed of 4 humors, or liquids, and the amount of those liquids within your body determines your overall health and wellness. Because blood was the easiest of those humors to be removed from your body, bloodletting became a common cure for diseases from the Roman Empire through the Middle Ages in Europe. Which, I hate to break it to you, Galen, removing blood from your body when you're sick is not the best idea, and that dominated scientific thought for so long. But hindsight is 20/20, so. Now, 2 scientists helped to disprove Galen's theory, Andreas Vesalius and William Harvey. Vesalius, through his dissection of cadavers and his highly detailed drawings of his findings, contradicted Galen's humoral theory. His findings set the foundation for later scientist William Harvey, who, by the way, was the court physician for James I and Charles I of England. Harvey studied the circulatory system in the body and proved that it is indeed one integrated system, not 4 separate liquid systems. Hey, you know how in your high school science classes you talk about the scientific method? I feel like you've been learning that since maybe even elementary school. The one that focuses on observation, question, hypothesis, experimentation, analysis, and conclusion. Yeah, that's also called the inductive reasoning method, and it was formulated by a guy named Francis Bacon. Now, Bacon was an opponent of scholasticism, which was an educational theory based on Aristotle and early church fathers. Bacon was like, heck no with tradition. With all this new learning, let's look at things with fresh eyes. Rather than relying on old school knowledge, let's observe the world and then see what we can find and experiment and test things out on our own. René Descartes took this an even further step. A true skeptic, Descartes wanted to make sure that all of his knowledge was built on a proper foundation of understanding. Rather than just rejecting knowledge, he sought to explain the reason for what he believed. I think, therefore I am. Descartes' use of deductive reasoning, think of it like a geometric proof where conclusions are drawn based on a recognition of patterns, incorporated the use of mathematics in scientific reasoning. He also believed that nature is made up of 2 substances, the intangible mind and the tangible matter. This dualist belief, this separation of spirit and matter, contributed to the secularization of European society. And while thinkers in the scientific revolution attempted to figure out the laws that govern the natural world, philosophers in the Enlightenment attempted to figure out the laws that govern human society. And just like with the scientific revolution, there are just a lot of people that you need to know. Now, the people you absolutely need to know for the AP test are Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and Adam Smith. And I'm going to talk about them obviously, but I'm also going to highlight some other philosophers that contributed immensely to political and intellectual thought during the Enlightenment. But I first need to start out by defining 2 important theories that I will keep referencing as I talk about these Enlightenment philosophers: the state of nature and the social contract. Now, the state of nature is how humans would act without a government. Think of it like we're all hanging out in a forest together and we have no understanding of political structures or anything like that. It's how humans would act in the absence of large institutions that mandate how one should behave. And the social contract is how people interact with each other within society. We've all seen The Good Place, right? Think of that. What do we owe to each other? In order for a society to exist and to flourish, how should you treat others? How do people interact with institutions? In order to have a government that protects you, are you okay with sacrificing some of your individual rights? With those defined, let's start in England and talk about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Hobbes was born in the 1580s and lived during the English Civil War. We remember the English Civil War, right? All the regicides, lots of death, lots of chaos. As a result of living through this tumultuous time, Hobbes believed that life in the state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In his book Leviathan, Hobbes argues that people in the state of nature would be in a constant state of war, and that the ideal form of government is absolutism. He believed that people should surrender their rights to one powerful king who will maintain order over everyone. I mean, look at the frontispiece of his book. The king is holding a sword and a crozier, and he is literally made up of the people. Now, this other English philosopher, John Locke, is often contrasted with Hobbes, but I think that contrast kind of ends with the types of government that they would support. Thomas Hobbes would support absolutism, and John Locke supports constitutionalism. Locke, in his State of Nature, believed that people will act in self-preservation, but stated that all mankind, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, or possessions. Locke, a practicing Christian, believed that all people were born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that it was the duty of the government to make sure that those natural rights are being protected. Now, Locke challenged the traditionally held view of government, which is that power comes from God or from tradition, and instead believed that the government's power comes directly from the consent of the governed. In his social contract, Locke believes that people will submit to the government's rule over them if the government protects those people's natural inalienable rights. Here's where it gets a bit radical, though, for the time at least. Locke believes that if a government is failing to protect the rights of its citizens, it is the duty of the people to overthrow that government and establish a government that does protect the rights. He's advocating for revolution, and boy, do those English colonists in the Americas really take that to heart less than a century later. Let's move on to some French philosophers: Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Diderot. Hey, did you know that Voltaire is actually a pen name? Francois-Marie Arouet began to use the name Voltaire because he kept getting thrown into jail because of his biting and witty criticisms of the French royal family. Also, as a result of his repeated jailings, he was a huge proponent of free speech and believed that people should be able to freely criticize the government without fear of punishment. He was actually exiled to England for 3 years, and it was during that stay that he witnessed things like religious toleration, economic freedom, and that nobles had to pay taxes, and he started to view England as a more enlightened nation than France. This inspired him to write Like He's Running Out of Time and instigated his critique of the institution of the Catholic Church in France. He himself was a deist and began to fight for the importance of religious toleration, which he did not see in his home country. Rousseau! There are things that I really like about this guy, but sometimes it's hard for me to get over the fact that he believed that women were only suited for the domestic sphere and had no place at all in the political sphere. In his State of Nature, Rousseau believed that humans were naturally good and would inherently seek the benefit of others. He believed that it was civilization itself, the institutions and powers that arise as a result of civilization, that corrupted this moral humanity. Rousseau was the one who coined the problematic term noble savage to articulate his belief that those living outside of civilization were intelligent, selfless, and egalitarian. He believed that in order for people to live their best lives, people need to prevent societal corruption in their youth, as youth is the closest thing to his ideal state of nature. Rousseau was a massive supporter of child-centered exploratory education as a result. Now, a huge difference between Rousseau and other Enlightenment philosophers is while they focus on reason, rationalism, and skepticism, Rousseau focuses on emotions. He paves the way for the later Romantic movement. Oh, Montesquieu. I will keep this one short, sweet, and to the point. In his book On the Spirit of Laws, he articulated that climate and geography dictated political development. Large nations like Russia often chose despotism, medium nations like Spain opted for monarchy, and small nations like the Dutch Republic tended toward republics. He was a proponent of limiting the power of the monarch, which he said could be done through a system called checks and balances. Look, Baron de Montesquieu is 3 words. We have 3 branches of government in the US. That's how you can remember that. Denis Diderot, what a guy. Diderot desired to compile and collect all of human knowledge into his encyclopedia. He believed that if people have free access to information, they then can have the ability to question things like political or religious institutions. Diderot was like the internet of his time, y'all, but also probably like way smarter and kinder. Just an important reminder that these Enlightenment philosophers are not doing this in a vacuum. They're meeting together to discuss their political and intellectual theories. And where are they doing that? In coffee shops. Caffeine, the drug that aided the Enlightenment. While coffee shops were for the middle class and Masonic lodges, Yes, like the Freemasons and National Treasure were for the super elite upper class, like the high up politicians. Salons were where the average up-and-coming intellectuals, financiers, and thinkers met. And y'all, these salons were hosted by women. The most famous salonier, Madame de Joffrin, spearheaded these discourses and, as the one in charge of the guest list, facilitated incredible discussions about the way of the world and what progress could look like for Europe. You know that question that people sometimes ask? They're like, hey, if you could eat dinner with 5 people, alive or dead, who would those 5 people be? And then you come up with a list of like the smartest or coolest or hippest people that you just want to like throw in a room together to see what they would say about like the hot topics of the day. Yeah, that's a salon. Speaking of women, I need to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a huge opponent of Rousseau and his position on women. She, in her vindication of the rights of women, argued that women only appear inferior to men because they lack equal access to education. And as a result, she was, of course, a huge proponent of women receiving an education, so much so that when she was 25 years old, she founded her first school for girls. As always, this debate about women continues as Enlightenment philosophers debated the extent to which these natural liberties and inalienable rights extended toward women. Students, I know this is so much, but I'm almost done with these philosophers, I promise. I need to first talk about Italian philosopher Cesare Beccaria, mainly so that I can talk about the Academy of Fists. Now, Beccaria formed the Intellectual Academy of Fists, which was dedicated to waging relentless war against economic disorder, bureaucratic tyranny, religious narrow-mindedness, and intellectual pedantry. He anonymously published On Crimes and Punishment, which was quoted by Thomas Jefferson and Catherine II of Russia, by the way, in which she advocated for radical beliefs like justice should not be vengeful, the degree of punishment should fit the crime, and torture is wrong. Ugh. Love that guy. Now, over the course of the Enlightenment, deism is becoming more common, but so is atheism. Intellectual Baron de Holbach said that because God does not possess a material nature, he cannot be real. De Holbach argued that religion restricted potential human progress. It's over the course of the Enlightenment that the shift toward deism or even toward atheism makes religion increasingly a matter of private concern, not public affairs. However, this shift away from religion also leads to religious reactions as leaders were fearing the decline of spirituality. There's a revival of German pietism during this time with its focus on spiritual experiences. So whereas the Enlightenment says to rely on reason and rationalism, one religious response was to rely on emotions and feelings. One last thing before I break, my students. There's one last thing these Enlightenment thinkers are challenging: economic institutions. Mercantilists believed that hard money was the source of wealth, but new economic thinkers called physiocrats believed that it was land and its resources. Francois Quesnay, a French physiocrat, believed that the wealth of a nation was derived from agriculture. Physiocrats favored free trade and open markets and believed that mercantilist policies, by restricting trade, violated the natural laws of economics. Scottish thinker Adam Smith followed in the physiocrats' footsteps and espoused free trade and a free market, outlining capitalistic economic policies. So, to summarize, Enlightenment philosophers attempt to make a better society and minimize suffering through a focus on rationalism and reason, and through debating political representation, the rights of man, limitations on rulers, and the role of religion. Okay. That was a lot. You're going to pause this video right now, and first thing you're going to do is go through the scientific revolution section and the Enlightenment section of that sheet I had you download at the beginning of the video. You're going to circle the people that you don't know, check off the people that you do know, and just interact with it a little bit. Let those thoughts marinate in your brain, and then you're going to take a brain break. I need you to stand up, take a walk, do some stretches, do not get on your phone. Just take time away from this environment that you're in right now, and then come back whenever you're ready to learn about how this Enlightenment thought impacted political development. Did you have a nice brain break? All right, it's time to move on. Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu all started to advocate for different enlightened approaches to political power. But where are all of these new political theories going to take place? You think that they're going to take place in Western Europe, students? You think that Louis XIV is going to start tolerating non-Catholics? You think that the Sun King wants to adopt new enlightened economic practices? Heck no. These start to take root in Central and and Eastern Europe. No, I'm going to talk about 3 enlightened absolute rulers: Joseph II of Austria, Frederick II of Prussia, and Catherine II of Russia. Now, these Enlightenment rulers still ruled absolutely. They had all the power, but they did start to incorporate some enlightened philosophies into their rule, like that the ruler should promote the good of the people, religious toleration should exist, standardized legal codes are important, and people within their lands should have increasing access to education. Let's start out with Joe. Now, after the Peace of Westphalia, Prussia began to rise as the dominant power within the former Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs, as a result, shifted their power to the east, to Austria. Joseph, the eldest son of Maria Theresa, was solidly an enlightened absolute monarch. Joseph abolished censorship, increased access to education so that 25% of school-aged kids could actually attend school, and his religious reforms lifted restrictions that had been placed on Jews and granted more equality toward Greek Orthodox Christians and Protestants. Now, Joseph actually stands out to me here compared to the other 2 enlightened absolute monarchs because of the way that he advances the status of peasants. Whereas both Fred and Kat maintained serfdom, Joseph ordered that peasants be given property rights and be paid for their labor with cash. On to Fred. In his essay, Anti-Machiavel, Frederick articulated that the ruler should be a servant of the state and should be concerned with the well-being of its subjects. I mean, the essay is literally called Anti-Machiavel, and he critiques Machiavelli's The Prince chapter by chapter. In contrast to Louis XIV's I am the state, Frederick said, I am a servant of the state. Now, while social standings remained rigid during his rule, and while serfdom remained dominant under his reign, he did adopt some enlightened philosophies because he himself was a patron of Voltaire. His enlightened reforms included religious toleration, freedom of the press, compulsory education systems with a focus on literature, music, and science, and he quite drastically reformed the Prussian judicial system. I mean, he abolished torture and codified the first German law code. He also happened to be a military genius, which definitely set Prussia up for success in the future. All right, final one. Let's talk about Kat. I feel like history remembers her like either very positively or very negatively. Catherine becomes Tsar of Russia after her husband Peter III is assassinated, and she was involved in the assassination plot. Do you remember how Peter I was concerned with westernizing Russia? Catherine absolutely continues that. Just as Peter admired Western culture, she herself was a lover of French culture and preferred to speak French over Russian or German. She invited Voltaire and Diderot to her court, and Diderot even served as her personal librarian for a time. Like Joe and Fred, she stressed the importance of education and abolished torture during her reign. In stark contrast to Joseph, however, the status of serfs was awful during her reign. In an attempt to take power, a Cossack named Pugachev led a huge serf uprising, and Catherine's just solid defeat of this Pugachev rebellion solidified her power and solidified serfdom in Russia for a long time. Also, look, students, history remembers Catherine and Frederick as being the Great, but it does not remember Joseph as being the Great. What's up with that? That's actually a pretty great thought experiment for you to have right now, or even in your classes. All right, let's wrap up this unit by talking about culture and arts. All of those philosophers and thinkers and scientists start writing down their theories, and those are widely circulated by newspapers, periodicals, pamphlets, and books. People like Jane Austen begin writing their own works of literature, which were being read by an increasingly literate European society. That trend from Unit 3 continues here, as people are writing their own works of literature in their own languages about their own lives and society. It starts to impact public opinion and also form national identities. And not only that, but because books are now easier to come by, people start reading about lives that are very different than theirs. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected by the late 1700s. And of course, art is going to reflect this new commercial society, which we can still most clearly see in the Dutch Golden Age. Going along with civic participation, neoclassicism emerges, but I will definitely talk about that more when I get to Napoleon in the next unit. Really, over the course of the 1600s and the 1700s, the arts move away from this religious theme and focus on royal power, like your classic Baroque art and music, to a focus on private life and public good. Now, by the 1700s in Europe, the agricultural revolution had happened and the commercial revolution had happened, which means that food supply had increased and the population was steadily growing. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, after her time spent in the Ottoman Empire, brought inoculation back to Europe, and as a result of that, plague and many major epidemic diseases started to decrease. Now, because of the agricultural revolution, more food could be produced using fewer workers, which means that more former farmers were moving to cities to find jobs, and urbanization increased. And as I've talked about in previous units, urbanization poses problems for local governments because now you have a lot of people living in one consolidated area. Poverty, crime, and prostitution all increased as a result. But there are people who are benefiting off of economic changes that are happening in Europe. New urbanites, if you will, and they have increasingly nice lives. The scientific revolution's new advancements led to a decrease in infant mortality, and as a result, there was an increase in focus on child rearing and childhood development. And now that there's this emerging middle class with a somewhat disposable income, and also because trade is still widespread across Europe and connecting all of the hemispheres together, these wealthier people start to buy new consumer goods for their homes, like prints and porcelain. Man, Europe at the end of the 18th century is like drastically different than what Europe looked like in the 15th century. Those Europeans challenged traditionally held sources of power in a ton of ways, and this unit particularly looked at political, scientific, and economic changes. But man, we have all this new political theory that's being discussed widely across Europe, and Europeans are more literate, and now they have all these ideas that are swaying public opinion. I wonder what's going to happen in Europe in like the late 1700s or early 1800s. It's going to be fine, right? So to summarize Unit 4, scientifically, scientists in the scientific revolution start to utilize math and empirical knowledge in order to figure out the laws that govern the natural world. Politically, philosophers formulate different political theories that are based on a social contract or the state of nature. And socially, population is increasing. People are moving to cities, and more money means fun new things to buy, for the middle and upper classes at least. That's it for Unit 4. So students, what I want you to do right now is go back to that document that you already worked on a little bit about halfway through this video, and then make sure that you're checking off the terms that you do know, you're circling or highlighting the terms that you don't know. Spend some time thinking about, in your own words, summarizing those thematic developments over the course of this unit, and then maybe even work on some skills practice either individually or with a study group. And students, be sure to check out all of the other resources that I have for you for this unit. I know this unit is a lot, so I gave you a lot of resources to achieve maximum success. As always, you can do it. I believe in you. Okay, bye.